living through extraordinary times, a pandemic, a recession, this unusual election. And tonight, we do know that more people are voting early than any time in history. This current rate is over 6 times last cycle, topping 47 million ballots in. If this continues, we could see some of the highest turnout ever. And no matter which candidate you like, that's objectively a great thing for democracy. In fact, in democracies around the world, experts view high participation as positive. And if voter turnout falls too low, it's viewed as a potential warning for civic decay. Now, this shouldn't be a partisan issue. I could point you to high turnout elections where Democrats won the White House, like '08, or where the GOP won, like Ronald Reagan. But there is a sad fact today. The evidence shows that the current Republican Party under Trump does not support high civic or voter participation. It does not welcome high levels of voting. Now, that may sound like criticism. That may sound incriminating. But I'm just here to give you facts, and it is literally what Trump admits he thinks. He thinks if you have high levels of voting, then Republicans don't get elected.
They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
That's wrong. Government should never restrict voting to distort elections, of course, because one, it violates citizen rights, regardless of any outcome effect. And two, it can distort the outcome, which ruins the point of having a democracy. And yet efforts to limit the vote in the U.S. are rampant, which brings us to tonight's special report. We think it may be crucial to your right to vote right now. Big picture, the coverage of elections often sort of assumes a level playing field. We hear about polls and turnout models and voting mechanics that are inside this current universe. But it doesn't always reflect how voter suppression looms over all of this. And there's a paradox here in American history. This is a nation that did lead the world towards a more democratic model of government, which is a plus. But this is not a nation that's honored everyone's equal right to vote. The founders were ahead of their time in some ways. They presented ideals that'd be quoted for hundreds of years, and they were behind the demands of moral obligations of equality in many other important ways. So when people say things like America's the world's oldest democracy, it's partly true that America has a pioneering experiment in voting, and it is also false if you just use the definition of democracy as a system where everyone votes. Because this nation began by barring most people from voting. It was only for wealthy white men who had land or paid taxes. We know that changed slowly over time. In fact, if you just read the Constitution, you'll see there are more amendments for expanding voting than any other single topic. One in 1870 that said all men could vote, purportedly including black men. 50 years later, you have one that says all women could vote, and other groups have fought to extend and democratize the vote. And people began to choose U.S. senators directly instead of state politicians in another constitutional reform. And so while some of those expansions were consistent, for example, once women got that right to vote legally, there were not new state laws cracking down on voting by gender. But it's always been different with race in America. Broad reforms that extended voting rights were then met with backlashes to limit them. New constitutional amendments that push forward voting rights are then pulled back through things that you've heard about, the poll taxes, the literacy tests, the voter purges, intimidation, and yes, even violence and anti-black terrorism. New protections then later pushed forward federal laws to protect the right to vote, including MLK's Voting Rights Act. Then that gets pulled back in the courts and attacked by other means, like recent restrictive voter ID laws. This is an important layer we all need to keep in mind because it's relevant, this long history of racism, regardless of political party. But today, as an additional political matter, something runs alongside this, and it's an electoral reality that some people aren't comfortable just bluntly discussing. But when more people vote in U.S. national elections, Republicans do very poorly. There are some places, of course, where Republicans do well with high turnout, like, say, Kentucky or Georgia, but not in national elections. When more people vote, when there's high turnout, Republicans just tend to lose. You can see that in the total votes. More people voted to put a Democrat in the White House in 2016. You can see it in the fact that Democrats win the White House typically by far more than Republicans. We checked by about 7 million, whereas when Republicans do it, it's more like 84,000. Then there's a starker way to see this. no matter what the choices have been in the modern era, from the Republican Party's new lurch to Trump, to more traditional options like John McCain, to several of those races with Bushes, Americans actually tend to just choose the Democrat for president. Did you know that's the case in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections? 6 out of 7. Sounds wild, but here's that history. It may not always feel this way because in 2 of these races, the less popular Republican candidate with fewer votes ended up in the White House in 16 and 2000. But that's the blue tendency. That's why the modern Republican Party has a problem. Now, there's more than one way to deal with it, but instead of trying to appeal to more of those blue majorities, the GOP is often focused on finding narrow paths in the Electoral College, which is legal, by the way, but also it's experimented with trying to continue these efforts to suppress the right to vote, sometimes illegally. Now, this is a reality today. Republicans don't simply need to motivate their base. In national races, they try to deflate Democratic turnout. Now, some of that is legal, I want to be very clear. Candidates, for example, can use their words to discourage the other side from turning out. The government can even regulate voting in ways that impact turnout legally up to a point. Then there are the other ways that this can be criminal, like formal voter suppression. Now, state officials are clashing right now about how to count mail ballots. And if it's a close result, you may hear a lot more about this. Republicans have been arguing for stricter approaches, which can be legal. Pennsylvania GOP trying to limit the counting of mail votes, for example, and a deadlocked Supreme Court just rejected that. Then you have the rollback of MLK's Voting Rights Act, which has enabled many southern states to legally close over 1,000 polling places. But that's not all. Republicans have been pushing new voter restrictions across 41 different states in the past decade, including something that was never demanded in hundreds of years of our American experiment in voting, trying to create this new legal requirement that citizens must bring a photo ID just to vote.
We're protecting the integrity of each and every vote here in the state of Wisconsin.
The photo ID laws are intended to stop impersonation fraud, double voting.
Your vote can be stolen. The very freedom of our nation is based on the integrity of our ballot box.
If you have to show a picture ID to buy Sudafed, you should have to show picture ID to protect the one of the most valuable, most central, sacred rights and blessed within America, the right to vote.
No. The Constitution holds the opposite. If you have an important right like free speech, the government can't just add random burdens and restrictions to it. You have the right to march or criticize the government right now, even if you don't bring ID to the march. But these Republican efforts, it's important to understand, they were not genuinely about confirming the identity of who's voting. They were about something else that many...
We want to do everything we can to help our side, and sometimes we think that's voter ID, sometimes we think that's longer lines, whatever it may be.
I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
Then I found out the real reason for the law.
The law is going to kick the Democrats in the butt.
Hillary Clinton is about the weakest candidate the Democrats have ever put up, and now we have photo ID, and I think photo ID is going to make a little bit of a difference as well.
This will certainly drive up turnout. This will be extremely devastating to Republicans and conservatives in Georgia.
They had things, levels of voting that if you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
There you have it. The photo ID wasn't about election integrity. It was about helping a party. Trump just plagiarized this playbook like he plagiarized his campaign slogan. Now, this operates in addition to the racial issues I mentioned to reduce the vote, sometimes legally. 35 states right now still use these voter ID laws. And the facts matter. This may overlap with the historically racist playbook, but it's also wielded against a wider group of voters who are targeted as potential Democrats. And I want to be clear, there's other efforts that can be flatly illegal. It's a crime for campaigns to try to stop someone from voting. So formal voter suppression is different than these state laws. And this is wrong no matter the goal of the party or person doing it. But Republicans are facing the evidence of doing it more lately. Now, Trump took it in a very different.
They even want to try to rig the election at the polling booths.
I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally.
He is going to lose the popular vote by about 2.5 million votes.
That voter fraud investigation and claims that massive voter fraud impacted the 2016 elections. It's why Donald Trump, he says, did not win the popular vote.
Clearly, this has gotten under his skin.
Got under his skin, and that's an important context because that was what Trump was doing, whether you remember it or not. Now, it fizzled. It did not turn up the promised voter fraud evidence. That commission disbanded. But Trump plowed on with this talk of things that would be illegal if practiced, from telling his side this year to vote twice to talking up intimidation at the polls, from law enforcement to militias. Now, this is important as people vote right now. The law forbids that. No person can intimidate, threaten, or coerce anyone trying to vote. This year's election is well underway. And let's be clear, there are signs people are voting regardless of all of these shenanigans. Record-breaking early turnout, plenty of mail and in-person voting, data showing Democrats leading, as there are long lines showing voter interest, a good sign for enthusiasm. Now, in terms of counting, the lines do show interest this year, but it shouldn't take hours to cast a ballot. It shouldn't take longer in one area than another, especially if partisan officials are making it harder for these reasons. Here's how one former Obama official put it. In Ohio this year, the long lines are happening not by accident, but design. Quarter-mile early voting lines in Democratic and minority areas in a state run by Republicans, the writer puts it bluntly. One of our two political parties sees representative democracy as a hassle or a threat. That is the context for the shuttering of these polling stations this year, just like it's the backdrop for Trump's attacks on types of voting that he thinks may run against him, like voting by mail, or Trump's botched effort just these past few months to kneecap the Postal Service. Now, on the one hand, it shouldn't take this much effort just to guard your right to vote. On the other hand, we're putting a light on this and scrutiny on it precisely because it was independent reporting and fierce pushback that exposed the plot to suppress the vote, including pressure from Speaker Pelosi and the public, which ultimately got Donald Trump's appointee to cave in a matter of days.
Post offices around the country are removing mail sorting machines.
The president is afraid of the American people. He wants to put obstacles of participation.
Protesters outside USPS Postmaster General Louis DeJoy's home.
The House Oversight Committee today calling on the Postmaster General to testify.
You can't take millions of ballots, send them haphazardly all over the country. It'll end up being a rigged election.
A major public revolt. 20 states plan to file lawsuits in federal court.
There will be no post office closures or suspensions.
I've suspended that until after the election.
Promising to deliver all election mail while taking zero responsibility for the measures implemented on his watch.
Doing exactly what President Trump said he wanted.
That's not efficiency. That's insanity.
This all just happened. That attempt to halt the vote was busted and blocked. Some other efforts to limit counting mail ballots floundering in the courts. States like Michigan now banning open carry near polling stations to stop anyone who might be inspired by Trump's talk to actually show up and join an army of poll watchers. So some of these crackdowns are being halted while, again, you have to understand the facts. Others continue in places where Republican politicians are still trying to intentionally make it harder for you to vote. Now, we're seeing voters respond by working harder than ever to vote. That's a short-term approach, while they also hope to wrest back control of government to thwart these efforts in the long term. Now, if this all sounds a little bit exhausting, it's supposed to. They don't want you to stay energized. This is a long-running tension in our American experiment. You know, here at The Beat, we sometimes reach to songs for meaning. Consider the ultimate American song, the Star-Spangled Banner. Conquer we must, when our cause is just, this be our motto, and God is our trust. The Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave. Okay, let's listen to that. It sounds nice, but is it true? You know, Jay-Z recently hoisted those iconic lines on their own illogical petard, noting, in the land of the free, where the blacks enslaved, 3/5 of a man, I believe's the phrase. Asking us to question what's free in a nation built on slavery, what's democratic in a land where, as you just saw, these votes are so routinely suppressed. Now, this isn't new. This isn't easy. But I'm asking you, as you vote early or get ready to vote or talk to other people about voting, never let us forget the reason that people try to suppress your vote. It's because your vote is powerful. It's because your vote can change basically what America becomes next. And apparently, that reality about your vote scares some people. And when it comes to these groups most targeted, in the recent efforts I showed you, it's Democratic-leaning voters for partisan reasons, as well as black voters for partisan and racist reasons. Well, it doesn't have to be this way. So we give the last word on this issue to the first black president, who just spoke out this week about the potential power of getting black turnout even higher than it was in the recent surge when he was on the ballot.
We had the highest African-American turnout in history, but it was still only about 60%. When people say voting doesn't make a difference, we've never tried what it would look like if it was 80% voting.
Voting's about using the power we have. We can't just imagine a better future. We've got to fight for it. We've got to vote like never before. We've got to vote and then get some change and then vote some more and then get some more change and then keep on voting until we get it right.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.